Isn't it funny how it's every day for the thief and one day for the owner?
Oh, you think your poor little daddy or janitor will save you?
It's not fair.
I couldn't protect myself, and I just wanted him to stop.
You are hereby convicted for the murder of Trenton. And you're charged for manslaughter.
But wait. Isaiah's case exposes a brutal paradox in American justice. The abused become the accused. This isn't rare, it's a pattern. Let's dissect how the system fails black victims twice. Welcome to Dark Echoes Crime. Make sure you subscribe and share to friends so as to support this channel to bring experiences like this to the limelight. Let's begin. The marble floors of Courtroom 6B in the Manhattan Criminal Court gleamed under the fluorescent lights on that cold February morning in 2023. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, their signs proclaiming justice, revenge, class warfare, and everything in between. News vans choked the surrounding streets, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metal flowers seeking sun. Inside, every seat was occupied. Standing room only. The gallery packed with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, family members on both sides of an invisible divide, and those who simply needed to witness what many were calling the trial of the decade. This wasn't just another criminal case. This was a collision of two Americas. One of privilege, legacy admissions, and trust funds. The other of night shifts, sacrifice, and dreams deferred. What happened between these two worlds would expose the darkest corners of our education system, the cruelty that festers behind ivy-covered walls, and ask a question that would haunt a nation. When does a victim become a perpetrator? When does justice become revenge? The defendant sat at the defense table, hands folded, eyes forward. 23 years old. Thin. Wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, probably borrowed. His public defender shuffled papers beside him, already looking defeated before opening arguments even began. On the other side, the prosecution's table was a different universe entirely. 3 attorneys in bespoke suits, leather briefcases embossed with gold initials, confidence radiating from them like heat from asphalt in summer. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why that courtroom was so packed, why the nation held its breath, why this case became a referendum on class, race, and the American dream itself, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. Back to Ashford Academy. Ashford Academy wasn't just a school. It was an institution. A cathedral of privilege perched on 47 acres of manicured lawns in Westchester County, New York. Founded in 1887, its alumni roster read like a who's who of American power. Senators, CEOs, federal judges, 3 Supreme Court justices. The annual tuition? $68,000. Not including the mandatory donations, the trips abroad, the equipment fees, the endless fundraisers where parents competed to outspend each other for their children's social standing. The buildings were Gothic revival, all stone arches and stained glass, libraries that smelled of old leather and older money. The athletic facilities rivaled Division I colleges. Olympic-sized pool. Regulation tennis courts. A rowing team that trained on the Hudson. The cafeteria served sushi on Thursdays and had a juice bar with 16 different smoothie combinations. Every student had an iPad. Every classroom had smart boards. The theater could seat 800 and had hosted Broadway directors for the spring musical. This was Ashford Academy. This was where America's future leaders learned Latin, debated philosophy, and prepared for their inevitable ascension to the top of whatever field they chose to grace with their presence. And in this temple of privilege there was a janitor named Marcus Webb. Marcus had worked at Ashford for 11 years. He started when he was 31, after his wife died in a car accident, leaving him alone with a 2-year-old son named Isaiah. The job paid $32,000 a year, barely enough to cover rent in a studio apartment 40 minutes away, but it came with health insurance, and that was everything when you had a child to raise alone. Marcus was invisible to most of the students. They walked past him in the hallways, dropped trash beside wastebaskets he'd just emptied, spilled drinks they didn't bother to mention, scuffed floors he'd spent hours polishing. To them, he wasn't a person with dreams or struggles or a story. He was furniture that occasionally moved. But Marcus had a dream. He watched these children of fortune every day, saw the opportunities laid at their feet like rose petals before a bride, and he wanted that for Isaiah. Not the wealth necessarily, not the vacation homes and luxury cars, but the education, the exposure, the chance to be more than his circumstances. So Marcus made a proposal to the administration. Ashford had a policy, buried deep in their employee handbook, that allowed staff members to enroll their children at a reduced rate. The reduction was substantial, bringing the tuition down to $12,000 a year, deducted gradually from the employee's paycheck. It would leave Marcus with less than $1,500 a month to live on, but he'd make it work. Extra shifts, weekend jobs, whatever it took. The administration was surprised by the request. In the 11 years Marcus had worked there, no janitor had ever tried to use this policy. It was clearly written for administrators, for teachers, for people the school considered professionals. But it was in writing. They couldn't legally deny it. So in September of 2015, 8-year-old Isaiah Webb became the first child of a custodian to attend Ashford Academy. Isaiah was bright, curious. He loved to read, would lose himself in books about space and dinosaurs and ancient civilizations. Marcus had raised him in that tiny apartment filled with library books, teaching him that education was the way out, the way up, the way forward. Isaiah believed his father. He walked through Ashford's gates that first day with wonder in his eyes, his backpack too big for his small frame, his shoes from Payless, his shirt from Target, but his smile genuine and bright. The other children noticed him immediately. Not because of who he was, but because of who he wasn't. He didn't arrive in a BMW or a Mercedes. He walked from the employee parking lot with his father, who was wearing a janitor's uniform. He didn't have the newest iPhone. His lunch was packed in an old plastic container, not purchased from the gourmet cafeteria. He didn't know the private jokes, the shared vacations to Martha's Vineyard and the Hamptons, the social language that separated insider from outsider. But children, especially privileged children, can be cruel in ways that would make adults blush. And in that population of predominantly white students from families worth millions, Isaiah, a black child whose father cleaned their bathrooms, became a target. The bullying started small. Whispers. Snickers when he raised his hand in class. Accidental shoulder checks in the hallway. His desk getting moved to the back of classrooms. Invitations to birthday parties that never came while he watched everyone else compare their envelopes. But there was one student who made Isaiah's life particularly unbearable. One boy who seemed to take personal offense to Isaiah's existence at Ashford. One child who would, years later, sit in a different kind of institution and wish he could take back every word, every push, every cruel joke. His name was Trenton Ashford Whitmore IV. Yes, that Ashford. The Whitmore family had been founding members of Ashford Academy, their name literally carved into the cornerstone of the main building. Trenton's great-great-grandfather had donated the land. His grandfather had endowed the library. His father sat on the board of trustees and had donated $7 million for the new science wing. Trenton was American royalty, at least in this insulated world. Blonde hair always perfectly styled. Blue eyes that looked like they came from a Nordic tourism ad. Athletic, popular, effortlessly confident in the way only people who've never faced real adversity can be. He played lacrosse and tennis, got decent grades without much effort, and was already being groomed for Yale, where his father and grandfather had gone. Trenton was 10 years old when Isaiah arrived at Ashford. And from the very first day he decided that Isaiah didn't belong. It started in 3rd grade. Trenton would knock Isaiah's books off his desk when the teacher wasn't looking. He'd lead groups of boys in mocking Isaiah's clothes. "Nice shirt, Isaiah. Did your dad steal it from the lost and found?" The other boys would laugh, desperate for Trenton's approval, willing to join in the cruelty to maintain their social standing. Isaiah tried to be invisible. He kept his head down, didn't respond to the taunts, focused on his schoolwork. Marcus had taught him to be strong, to not let others determine his worth. But it's hard to maintain dignity when someone is tripping you in the cafeteria, making you spill your lunch tray while the entire room erupts in laughter. The teachers noticed. Of course they noticed. But they did nothing. Nothing meaningful. A boys will be boys attitude prevailed. A belief that this was just typical adolescent behavior, that Isaiah needed to toughen up, that intervening would only make it worse. And perhaps, though none would admit it, there was an institutional hesitation to discipline Trenton Whitmore, whose family name was on half the buildings, whose father's donations kept the school's endowment healthy. By 5th grade the bullying had intensified. Trenton had started a group text among the boys in their grade, excluding Isaiah, where they would share memes mocking him. They created a fake Instagram account called Janitor's Kid, where they posted unflattering photos of Isaiah taken without his knowledge, with captions mocking his clothes, his hair, his mere existence. The account gained followers among the student body. People who'd never even spoken to Isaiah participated in the cruelty from behind their screens. Isaiah told his father some of it, but not everything. He could see how hard Marcus worked, how tired he was, how he'd lost weight from skipping meals to save money. Isaiah didn't want to add to his father's burden. So he suffered in silence, developing stress headaches, anxiety that manifested in stomach aches, a depression that wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. Marcus knew something was wrong. A father knows. But Isaiah insisted he was fine, that school was good, that he was making friends. Marcus wanted to believe it. He needed to believe that his sacrifice was worth it. In middle school things got worse. Much worse. Puberty had amplified all the social hierarchies, all the cruelties. Trenton had grown into his looks, become even more popular, started dating girls who looked like they belonged in catalogs. He played varsity lacrosse as an 8th grader, a rare achievement that elevated his status even further. He was untouchable. A god among boys. Isaiah, meanwhile, had grown tall but remained thin, awkward in his body, shy around girls who barely acknowledged his existence. He buried himself in books, in video games he played on an old console, in fantasies of a life where he wasn't tormented daily. The bullying had evolved beyond name-calling. Trenton and his friends started getting physical. Shoving Isaiah into lockers. Tripping him during gym class. Once, they locked him in a bathroom stall during lunch, left him there until a teacher found him, the entire cafeteria having heard what happened and snickering about it for weeks. Another time, Trenton convinced the lacrosse team to pants Isaiah in the locker room after PE. Isaiah stood there in his underwear, which his father had bought in a multipack from Walmart, while 30 boys laughed and took videos on their phones. The videos circulated through the school. Isaiah couldn't walk down a hallway without someone making a comment, some reference to that moment of ultimate humiliation. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from? And here's the real question. If you were Isaiah's parent, what would you have done? Let me know below. This story has people divided from New York to London to Toronto. I want to hear your take from your city. The school counselor called Isaiah in after that incident. Asked if he was okay. Asked if he wanted to talk about what was happening. Isaiah said he was fine. The counselor suggested Isaiah might want to work on his social skills, might want to try to fit in better. As if the problem was Isaiah's failure to adequately assimilate into a culture that had rejected him from day one. No one called Trenton in. No one asked him about his behavior. The unspoken rule at Ashford was clear. Some students mattered more than others. Marcus found out about the locker room incident when another janitor mentioned it, having heard students talking about the video. Marcus was devastated, furious, helpless. He went to the principal, a silver-haired man named Dr. Jonathan Pemberton who'd been at Ashford for 23 years. Dr. Pemberton's office was all dark wood and leather, degrees from Princeton and Harvard framed on the walls, a view of the school's grounds that must have reassured him daily that he presided over paradise. He listened to Marcus with what appeared to be concern, nodding in appropriate places, making sympathetic sounds. Mr. Webb, I assure you we take bullying very seriously at Ashford, Dr. Pemberton said in his practiced, soothing administrator voice. We'll look into this matter thoroughly. But I also must say, adolescence is a difficult time for everyone. Boys tease each other. It's part of growing up, learning to navigate social situations. Marcus sat across from him in his janitor's uniform, having taken his lunch break for this meeting, and tried to find words. Dr. Pemberton, sir, with respect, this isn't teasing. My son is being tormented. Every single day. They stripped him in front of everyone. They filmed it. That's not normal kid stuff. That's abuse. Dr. Pemberton's expression shifted slightly, a barely perceptible hardening around the eyes. Mr. Webb, I understand you're upset. Any parent would be. But we need to be careful about throwing around words like abuse. These are good kids from good families. Sometimes boys play rough. It doesn't mean there's malice. The Whitmore boy, Marcus said. Trenton. He's leading this. Everyone knows it. He's been targeting Isaiah since 3rd grade. There it was. The name that changed everything. Dr. Pemberton sat back in his chair, steepled his fingers. Trenton Whitmore is one of our finest students. He's a natural leader, excels in athletics, comes from a family that has given tremendously to this institution. I find it hard to believe he'd engage in the kind of behavior you're describing. Marcus felt something inside him crack. The realization that Isaiah would never be protected here, that the game was rigged from the start, that the Whitmore name would always matter more than Webb. But he'd sacrificed so much to get Isaiah here, was drowning financially to give his son this chance. He couldn't pull him out. Where would Isaiah go? Back to the underfunded public schools where class sizes were 40 students and the textbooks were 15 years old? Please, Marcus said, and he hated the pleading in his voice. Just talk to the boy. Tell him to leave Isaiah alone. That's all I'm asking. Dr. Pemberton nodded slowly. I'll have a conversation with Trenton. But Mr. Webb, I also think Isaiah might benefit from some counseling. To help him adjust, to build resilience. We have excellent counselors on staff. The message was clear. The problem was Isaiah's inability to cope with bullying, not the bullying itself. Marcus left that office feeling defeated. That night, he held Isaiah while his son finally broke down, finally told him everything. The texts, the social media, the constant daily erosion of his dignity and self-worth. Father and son cried together in their small apartment, and Marcus promised him it would get better, even though he didn't believe it. Dr. Pemberton did call Trenton in. Had a brief conversation about being kind to all students, and leadership meaning lifting others up. Trenton nodded in all the right places, said all the right things, and walked out of that office smirking. That afternoon he sent a text to his friends, just got called in about the janitor's kid. His dad is such a little bitch, when crying to Pemberton. We need to be more careful. Don't leave evidence. The bullying continued, but it went underground. More strategic. More psychological. Trenton and his friends would ignore Isaiah completely, acting like he didn't exist, which somehow felt worse than the overt cruelty. They'd have loud conversations near him about parties he wasn't invited to, about inside jokes he wasn't part of, about a world that would never include him. They'd sabotage his schoolwork. Steal pages from his notebook. Accidentally spill water on his homework. Get him in trouble by hiding things in his locker, then reporting him. Isaiah started getting called down to the dean's office regularly for violations he didn't commit, but the accusations always came from multiple students, credible students, students whose word was trusted implicitly. Isaiah's grades began to slip. His anxiety got worse. He started having panic attacks, would lock himself in bathroom stalls during lunch, hyperventilating, trying to calm down. He stopped sleeping well, would lie awake at night dreading the next day, running through scenarios trying to figure out how to make himself invisible. Marcus noticed his son disappearing before his eyes. This bright, curious boy who'd loved learning was becoming a ghost, hollow-eyed and silent. Marcus felt helpless, trapped. He'd taken a second job on weekends doing maintenance for an apartment complex just to make ends meet, which meant less time with Isaiah, but without the money they'd be homeless. It was an impossible situation. High school was supposed to be a fresh start. Ashford Academy's high school was in a different building, new teachers, bigger campus, more students since they accepted transfers from other schools for 9th grade. Isaiah hoped that maybe finally he could escape the target on his back. But Trenton was there too, of course. More popular than ever. Star of the varsity lacrosse team as a freshman, which was almost unheard of. Dating a senior girl who looked like she belonged on a runway. Wearing designer clothes that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. Already being recruited by elite colleges. And Trenton hadn't forgotten about Isaiah. Hadn't forgiven Isaiah for existing, for being a visible reminder that not everyone at Ashford belonged to their rarefied world. The bullying continued, evolved, became more sophisticated as the boys grew older. In 10th grade, Trenton started a rumor that Isaiah had been caught stealing from other students' lockers. It wasn't true, of course, but the rumor spread like wildfire. Parents heard about it from their children, mentioned it to other parents, whispered about whether the school's scholarship program was really a good idea if it brought in those kinds of people. Isaiah was called into the dean's office, questioned aggressively about thefts he knew nothing about. His locker was searched in front of other students. Nothing was found, but the damage was done. Everyone looked at him differently now. He was a suspect, a potential thief, someone to be watched carefully. The same year, someone hacked Isaiah's school email and sent crude, inappropriate messages to several female students, pretending to be him. The messages were vulgar, sexual, disturbing. Isaiah had to sit through meetings with administrators, had to endure the hostile stares of girls who thought he'd harassed them, had to explain that he'd never written those things, that someone must have accessed his account. The school's IT department confirmed that the emails had been sent from a different IP address, that Isaiah's account had been compromised. But again, the damage was irreversible. Girls avoided him in hallways. Boys talked about beating him up for disrespecting their girlfriends. No one cared about the truth once the accusation had been made. And through it all, Trenton watched with barely concealed satisfaction. He'd learned to be careful, to never leave fingerprints, to let others do his dirty work while he maintained his perfect image. He was Teflon. Nothing stuck to him. Isaiah's mental health deteriorated severely. He started seeing a therapist that Marcus could barely afford, a kind woman who diagnosed him with severe anxiety and depression, who prescribed medication that made him feel numb but at least got him through the days. He stopped hoping for things to get better. He just tried to survive. Junior year was the breaking point. By then, Isaiah was 16, Trenton was 17, and the social hierarchies of high school were fully entrenched. Trenton was applying to colleges, all Ivy League, all guaranteed to accept him based on his legacy status and his family's donations. He was everything Ashford Academy was designed to produce: confident, accomplished, connected, destined for power. Isaiah, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain AB average, his college prospects uncertain, his future unclear. He'd stopped participating in class. Ate lunch alone in the library. Had no friends, no social life, no joy. He was just going through the motions, counting down the days until he could escape Ashford and never look back. But Trenton wasn't done with him yet. Not even close. It was November of Isaiah's junior year when things came to a head. The lacrosse team was having a party at Trenton's house, a massive estate in a gated community that looked like something from a magazine. His parents were away for the weekend, as they often were, traveling for business or pleasure, trusting their son to behave in their absence. The party was legendary even by Ashford's standards. 200 students showed up. There was alcohol, drugs, a DJ, a pool lit up with colored lights. It was the kind of party that defined your social status. If you were invited, you mattered. If you weren't, you didn't exist. Isaiah, obviously, was not invited. He was home that night in the apartment, doing homework, watching Netflix, trying not to think about the party that everyone would be talking about for weeks. But Trenton had a plan. A final humiliation to cement Isaiah's status as the school's permanent outcast. Trenton told several people at the party that Isaiah had shown up uninvited, drunk, trying to crash. That Isaiah had gotten aggressive when told to leave. That Isaiah had grabbed a girl inappropriately, tried to force himself on her. None of it was true. Isaiah was home, had never been near the party. But Trenton took a video at the party of a crowded room, claiming Isaiah was somewhere in the chaos, and posted it on social media with a caption about calling the cops on a creepy stalker who can't take a hint. By Monday morning, the entire school believed Isaiah had sexually assaulted someone at Trenton's party. The story had grown in the telling, as these things do. Different versions circulated. Some said Isaiah had attacked multiple girls. Others said he'd been high on drugs, violent, threatening. The details varied, but the core accusation was consistent. Isaiah Webb was dangerous, a predator, someone to be feared and shunned. The school launched an investigation. Isaiah was suspended pending the outcome. He tried to explain that he'd never been at the party, that he could prove it, that his father could confirm he'd been home all night. Marcus fought for his son with a desperation that bordered on fury, providing phone records, threatening to go to the police, to the media, to anyone who would listen. The school's investigation eventually cleared Isaiah. There was no evidence he'd been at the party. The girl Trenton claimed Isaiah had assaulted came forward to say she'd never even met Isaiah, that Trenton had asked her to just go along with it as a joke. Other students started admitting they hadn't actually seen Isaiah at the party, they'd just heard about it. Isaiah was allowed to return to school after a 3-week suspension. But the accusation lingered like a stain. People still believed it, wanted to believe it, found it more interesting than the truth. Isaiah walked through hallways where students whispered and stared, where girls clutched their bags tighter when he passed, where boys made comments about keeping their girlfriends away from the creep. Something inside Isaiah broke during those 3 weeks. The last bit of hope, of resilience, of belief that things might someday improve. He came back to school different. Quieter. Darker. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something hollow and defeated and dangerous. Marcus saw it too. Begged Isaiah to talk to him, to see his therapist more frequently, to consider transferring schools even though it would mean giving up on the dream they'd sacrificed so much for. But Isaiah just smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said he was fine, that he could handle it, that he just had to get through one more year and then he'd never have to see any of these people again. That was the lie he told himself to get through each day. Just survive until graduation. Just endure. Just keep your head down and count the days. But Trenton wasn't done. Even after the false accusation fell apart, even after it was clear he'd orchestrated the entire thing, even after multiple students had come forward to say he'd pressured them to lie, Trenton faced no consequences. His father made a generous donation to the school's scholarship fund, perhaps as a tacit acknowledgement of his son's behavior, perhaps to ensure continued institutional goodwill. Dr. Pemberton called it a misunderstanding, and moved on. Trenton graduated that year, headed to Yale as planned, left Ashford Academy as a legend. The trophy cases held his awards. The halls echoed with stories of his athletic achievements. He gave a speech at graduation about Ashford's values, about integrity and excellence and leadership. People applauded. His parents beamed. The whole thing was picture perfect. Isaiah was in the audience that day, watching Trenton in his white graduation gown, listening to him talk about honor and community. And Isaiah felt something cold settle into his chest. A realization that there was no justice in this world, no cosmic balance, no karma coming to set things right. People like Trenton won. People like Isaiah lost. That was just how it worked. Senior year for Isaiah was a blur. He went through the motions, applied to colleges he couldn't afford, worked part-time at a grocery store to help his father with bills. Marcus was aging rapidly, the stress and overwork etching lines deep into his face, his body breaking down from years of physical labor and financial strain. Isaiah graduated with little fanfare. No college acceptance letters. No plan. Just a diploma from Ashford Academy and a decade of trauma he'd carry with him forever. He got a job working at a warehouse, lifting boxes for minimum wage, trying to figure out what came next. Marcus was devastated. All those years, all that sacrifice, and his son ended up in the same economic position Marcus had been trying to help him escape. The dream had failed. Worse than failed. It had traumatized his boy in ways that might never heal. But life moved on. Isaiah worked his warehouse job. Tried to forget Ashford. Tried to build something resembling a normal existence. He'd started saving money, thinking maybe he'd go to community college eventually, try to resurrect some version of his educational dreams. And then in the fall of 2022, Isaiah saw Trenton again. It was October 15th, a Thursday night. Isaiah was leaving his shift at the warehouse around 11 p.m., walking to the bus stop. The neighborhood was sketchy, a part of the Bronx where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. Isaiah had his headphones in, was exhausted from 10 hours of manual labor, just wanted to get home. And there, outside a bar called Murphy's Pub, was Trenton Whitmore. Same blonde hair, same confident posture, wearing expensive casual clothes that probably cost more than Isaiah made in a month. He was with a group of friends, other wealthy-looking 20-somethings, laughing loudly, clearly drunk. Isaiah froze. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen Trenton at graduation. 5 years of trying to forget, to move on, to heal. And here he was, looking happy and successful and untouched by consequence, like the universe was rubbing it in Isaiah's face one more time. Trenton didn't notice Isaiah at first. But one of his friends did, a guy Isaiah vaguely recognized from Ashford. The friend nudged Trenton, pointed at Isaiah, said something Isaiah couldn't hear. Trenton turned, and his face lit up with recognition and something else. Amusement? Contempt? That same look he'd worn for years at Ashford. Holy shit, Trenton called out, his voice carrying across the street. Isaiah Webb? Is that really you? What are you doing in this neighborhood? Shouldn't you be home cleaning toilets with your dad? His friends laughed. Drunk, casual cruelty. The kind they probably didn't even think about, just natural as breathing for people like them. Isaiah felt his hands clench into fists. 5 years of suppressed rage rising up like lava. Every humiliation, every beating, every sleepless night, every panic attack, every suicide thought he'd pushed away, all of it condensing into a white-hot fury. But he didn't respond. Just stood there, staring at Trenton, breathing hard, trying to control himself. Trenton stumbled forward a few steps, still grinning, playing to his audience. Come on, don't be like that. I'm just joking, man. Remember the good old days at Ashford? We had some fun times, didn't we? Fun. He'd called it fun. A decade of systematic psychological torture, and Trenton remembered it as fun. Leave me alone, Isaiah said quietly. What? Can't hear you, janitor's kid. Trenton cupped his hand to his ear in an exaggerated gesture. Speak up. His friends were eating it up, laughing, filming on their phones like this was entertainment. Isaiah stood there, shaking, on the edge of something he couldn't name. Walk away, his therapist's voice said in his head. Just walk away. Don't give him power over you. But Isaiah couldn't move. Couldn't walk away. Couldn't keep swallowing this forever. Trenton took another step forward, close enough now that Isaiah could smell the alcohol on his breath. You know, I heard you're working at some warehouse. That's perfect for you. Manual labor. Right where you belong. At least you're not pretending to be one of us anymore, right? That was always so awkward, watching you try so hard to fit in at Ashford. Something snapped inside Isaiah. Years of restraint, of turning the other cheek, of being the bigger person, all of it shattered in an instant. He didn't plan what happened next. Didn't think about consequences. His body moved before his mind could catch up. Isaiah shoved Trenton. Art. Trenton stumbled backward, surprised, his drunk coordination failing him. He tripped over his own feet and fell, hitting his head on the concrete curb with a sickening crack. Everything stopped. The laughter died. Trenton's friends stood there, frozen, trying to process what they'd just seen. Isaiah stood over Trenton's body, breathing hard, his hands still clenched into fists. Trenton didn't move. Blood began pooling beneath his head, black in the streetlight, spreading slowly across the sidewalk. "Trenton?" one of the friends said, his voice suddenly sober and scared. "Trent? Dude, get up." But Trenton didn't get up. Didn't move. Didn't respond. One of the friends dropped to his knees, pulled out his phone, called 911. Another started yelling at Isaiah, screaming that he'd killed him, that he was a murderer, that they'd seen everything. Isaiah stood there, looking at his hands like they belonged to someone else. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He just pushed him. Just one push. After everything Trenton had done to him, after years of torment, he'd finally pushed back. And now Trenton was on the ground, not moving, blood spreading like a dark halo around his head. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Isaiah should run, he knew. Should disappear into the night, try to escape this nightmare. But he couldn't move. Just stood there, staring at Trenton's body, at the blood, at the life draining out of the boy who'd made his own life hell for so many years. The ambulance arrived first, then the police. Paramedics swarmed around Trenton, checking for vitals, loading him onto a stretcher. One of them looked at the others and shook his head. That small gesture that meant everything. Trenton Whitmore was dead at 23 years old. A single push, a fall, a crack of skull against concrete, and the golden boy was gone. The police officers approached Isaiah, asked for his hands, put him in handcuffs. He didn't resist. Didn't speak. Just let them lead him to the patrol car while Trenton's friends shouted accusations, while phones recorded everything, while the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Isaiah Webb was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The bail was set at $500,000, an impossible amount for Marcus to pay even with a bail bondsman. Isaiah would wait in Rikers Island for his trial, 17 months in that brutal facility, surrounded by violence and despair, the same gray walls and hopelessness his entire life seemed to have been building toward. Marcus visited him every week, making the long trip on buses and trains, sitting across from his son in that visitation room, both of them trying to find words for something that had no words. Marcus had hired a public defender, the only lawyer he could afford, a tired woman named Jennifer Valdez who had 97 other cases and no time to give Isaiah's the attention it desperately needed. The prosecution, meanwhile, had unlimited resources. The Whitmore family was destroyed by Trenton's death, but they channeled their grief into a thirst for justice that looked a lot like vengeance. They hired 3 of the best prosecutors in New York as special consultants to the Manhattan DA's office. They leaked stories to the media portraying Trenton as a saint and Isaiah as a violent criminal who'd been looking for an opportunity to hurt someone. The narrative was set before the trial even began. Trenton Whitmore, beloved son, stellar student, athlete, Yale man, his whole life ahead of him. Isaiah Webb, troubled young man with a history of behavioral issues, resentful of his betters, finally snapping and committing murder. The fact that Isaiah had been the victim of relentless bullying for years? Not relevant, according to the prosecution. Ancient history. Trenton had moved on, was thriving at Yale, had left his adolescent mistakes behind him. If Isaiah had issues with his high school experience, he should have sought therapy, not revenge. That's what they called it. Revenge. Not self-defense. Not a moment of lost control after being taunted one time too many. Premeditated revenge for perceived slights from years ago. The prosecution was arguing that Isaiah had been waiting for an opportunity to hurt Trenton, that he'd been carrying rage for years, that this was always inevitable. They brought up every incident from Ashford but twisted them. The locker room humiliation? Boys being boys, typical adolescent roughhousing, nothing sinister. The false sexual assault accusation? A misunderstanding that had been cleared up, no harm done. The years of systematic psychological abuse? The prosecution called it typical social struggles of high school, suggested Isaiah was overly sensitive, and failed to adjust. They painted Isaiah as someone who blamed others for his own failures, who resented success in others, who'd been harboring violent fantasies about harming Trenton for years. The media ate it up. Cable news ran with headlines like, "Warehouse worker kills Yale graduate in rage attack," and "Class resentment turns deadly in Manhattan." The story became a talking point about crime, about the dangers of the city, about young men and violence. Very few outlets bothered to investigate the history between Isaiah and Trenton, to ask why this encounter had turned fatal, to question what years of systematic abuse might do to a person's psyche. The Whitmore family gave tearful interviews. Trenton's mother, Diane, appeared on morning shows, holding framed photos of her son in his Yale lacrosse uniform, talking about the light that had been extinguished, the grandchildren she'd never have, the hole in her heart that would never heal. She was sympathetic, articulate, perfectly coiffed even in her grief. America's heart broke for her. No one interviewed Marcus. No one asked about the years he'd sacrificed for his son, the dreams that had been crushed, the systematic cruelty Isaiah had endured. Marcus was just the janitor, another supporting character in a story about the tragic death of a promising young man. Isaiah's public defender, Jennifer Valdez, did her best. She was a good attorney, passionate about justice, but she was drowning in cases and didn't have the resources to build the defense Isaiah needed. She tried to get evidence of the bullying admitted, tried to establish the context for what had happened that night, but the prosecution fought her at every turn. The judge, Honorable Richard Blackstone, was a 67-year-old Reagan appointee who'd built his career on being tough on crime. He'd sent thousands of defendants to prison, had a particular disdain for what he called excuse-making, and believed strongly in personal responsibility. When Jennifer tried to introduce evidence of Isaiah's treatment at Ashford, Judge Blackstone grew impatient. "Counselor," he said, his voice sharp with irritation, "this court is not interested in litigating high school drama. The defendant is charged with manslaughter. Either prove he acted in self-defense or move on." Self-defense. That was the problem. Trenton had been drunk and unarmed. He'd made verbal comments, yes, but he hadn't physically threatened Isaiah. In the eyes of the law, Isaiah had been the aggressor. The fact that Trenton had spent years psychologically destroying him, that this was the culmination of a decade of abuse, that Isaiah had finally broken under the weight of endless cruelty, none of that mattered in the cold logic of criminal law. The trial began on February 3, 2023. The courthouse was packed from day one. Protesters on both sides lined up outside. Some held signs demanding justice for Trenton, calling Isaiah a murderer, saying his actions proved he'd never belonged at Ashford in the first place. Others held signs supporting Isaiah, calling out systemic inequality, the way the justice system protected the wealthy and criminalized the poor. Inside, the courtroom was divided like the country itself. On one side sat the Whitmore family and their supporters, wealthy, white, dressed in expensive black clothing, their grief palpable and righteous. On the other side sat Marcus Webb, alone except for a few members of his church, people from the working-class neighborhood where he'd raised Isaiah, folks who understood the impossible situation the Webbs had found themselves in. The jury was selected over 3 days. 8 white jurors, 2 black, 1 Hispanic, 1 Asian. 7 men, 5 women. Ages ranging from 29 to 68. They'd all sworn they could be impartial, that they hadn't formed opinions about the case despite the massive media coverage. The defense had wanted to move the trial, to find a venue where the Whitmore name didn't carry so much weight, but the motion had been denied. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Marcus Chin, one of the special prosecutors the Whitmores had hired. He was in his 40s, sharply dressed, had a reputation for being ruthless and effective. He stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Chin began, his voice measured and grave, "this is a simple case with a tragic outcome. On the night of October 15, 2022, Trenton Whitmore was celebrating with friends. He was 23 years old, had just graduated from Yale University, was home visiting family, out enjoying a Thursday night the way young people do. He had his whole life ahead of him. Dreams of law school. Plans to work in public service. A girlfriend he was planning to propose to at Christmas. He was loved, accomplished, full of potential." Chin paused, letting that image settle over the jury. Then he turned, pointed at Isaiah sitting at the defense table in his borrowed suit, his eyes forward, his face carefully neutral. And then he encountered the defendant. Isaiah Webb. Someone who had known Trenton years earlier in high school. Someone who had never forgiven Trenton for being successful, for having opportunities Isaiah felt he deserved. Someone who had been nursing a grudge, feeding resentment, waiting for a chance to strike. Jennifer Valdez started to object, but Chin smoothly continued. The defendant didn't have to engage with Trenton that night. Didn't have to stop. Didn't have to listen to anything Trenton said. He could have walked away. Should have walked away. Like an adult. Like a civilized person living in a society governed by laws, not violence. Chen walked over to a large screen where the prosecution would display evidence. But the defendant didn't walk away. Instead, he assaulted Trenton Whitmore. Shoved him with such force that Trenton fell and struck his head on the concrete. Trenton died at the scene. And why? Because of words. Because someone said something the defendant didn't like. Because the defendant decided that his hurt feelings justified violence. The prosecution spent the next 6 hours presenting their case. They called Trenton's friends as witnesses, the young men who'd been there that night. Each one testified that Trenton had been in good spirits, a little drunk but not aggressive, just joking around when he saw Isaiah. It was harmless, one of them testified, a guy named Bradley Hutchinson who'd been in Trenton's fraternity at Yale. Trent was just being friendly, like, "Hey, I remember you from high school." He was smiling. And then out of nowhere, this guy just attacked him. On cross-examination, Jennifer tried to establish that Trenton's comments had been mocking, cruel, deliberately provocative. "Isn't it true," Jennifer asked Bradley, "that Trenton called Isaiah Janitor's kid multiple times that night?" Bradley shrugged. "I don't remember exactly what he said. Maybe something like that. It was just a joke though. Trenton joked around with everyone. And isn't it true that you and your friends were laughing at Isaiah, filming him on your phones, treating him like entertainment?" "We were filming because it was a weird situation. Some guy from high school randomly showing up in our neighborhood? Yeah, we thought it was funny. But we weren't doing anything wrong." "Did you know that Trenton had bullied Isaiah extensively throughout their time at Ashford Academy?" "Objection," Shin said, standing. "Relevance, Your Honor. What may or may not have happened years ago in high school is not relevant to what happened on the night in question." "Sustained," Judge Blackstone said, shooting Jennifer a warning look. "Move on, counselor." But Jennifer pressed. "Mr. Hutchinson, did Trenton ever talk about Isaiah Webb? About their history?" Bradley thought for a moment. "Maybe once or twice. He said there was this kid at his high school who was always awkward, didn't fit in. But that was it. Just mentioning someone from his past." "Did he ever mention bullying Isaiah? Tormenting him for years?" "No, nothing like that. Trent was a good guy. Everyone loved him." The prosecution also called the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who testified about Trenton's cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the skull. A subdural hematoma. Death would have been nearly instantaneous once his head struck the concrete. She displayed graphic photos of Trenton's injuries, his skull fractured, his brain swollen. Several jurors looked away. "In your expert opinion, Dr. Hoffman," Chen asked, "would these injuries be consistent with a forceful, deliberate shove?" "Yes," Dr. Hoffman replied. "The force required to cause Mr. Whitmore to fall with enough velocity to sustain these injuries would have been significant. This was not a light push or an accidental bump. This was a violent action." Jennifer's cross-examination focused on the variables. "Dr. Hoffman, isn't it true that Mr. Whitmore had a blood alcohol content of 0.18, well above the legal limit?" "That's correct. So his balance and coordination would have been significantly impaired?" "Yes, alcohol affects balance and reflexes. And isn't it true that the way someone falls, the angle they hit the ground, can be unpredictable? That a sober person might fall and be fine, while an intoxicated person might fall from the same push and sustain fatal injuries?" Dr. Hoffman nodded slowly. "That's possible. The outcome of a fall can depend on many factors: angle, surface, the person's physical condition, whether they're able to catch themselves." "So Isaiah Webb could not have predicted that his push would result in Mr. Whitmore's death?" "Objection," Chen said. "Calls for speculation." Sustained. The prosecution's case was methodical, building a narrative of unprovoked violence, of a defendant who'd let his anger override his judgment, of a senseless tragedy that could have been avoided if Isaiah had simply controlled himself. Then came the character witnesses for Trenton. His Yale professors talked about his brilliance, his dedication. His lacrosse coach described him as a natural leader, someone who elevated everyone around him. His girlfriend, a stunning brunette named Madison Prescott, testified tearfully about their plans for the future, the engagement ring Trenton had already bought, the family they dreamed of starting. "He was the best person I've ever known," Madison said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Kind, generous, funny. He lit up every room he walked into. And now he's gone because someone couldn't let go of the past." Jennifer didn't cross-examine Madison. There was no point. She was genuine in her grief, and attacking her would only make the jury hate the defense. The prosecution rested after 3 days. They'd built a compelling case: Trenton as the perfect victim, Isaiah as the dangerous aggressor, the killing is inexcusable regardless of context. Now it was the defense's turn, and Jennifer Valdez knew she was fighting an uphill battle. She stood to give her opening statement, looking at the jury, trying to see if any of them might be receptive to a more complicated truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer began, her voice clear and strong, "the prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple. But it's not. Nothing about this case is simple. What happened on October 15th was a tragedy, yes. Trenton Whitmore's death was tragic. His family's loss is real and profound. But the prosecution has told you only half the story. They've given you the ending without the context. And in criminal law, context matters." She walked toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. Isaiah Webb did not wake up that morning planning to hurt anyone. He went to work. He did his job. He was heading home, exhausted from a 10-hour shift, thinking about sleep. And then he encountered someone from his past. Someone who had made his life hell for 10 years. Someone who had bullied, tormented, and systematically destroyed him throughout his childhood and adolescence. "Objection," Chin said. "This is argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence." "Your Honor," Jennifer responded, "I'm outlining what the defense will prove through testimony and evidence." "Overruled," Judge Blackstone said, though he didn't look happy about it. "Continue but get to the point, counselor." Jennifer nodded. "The defense will show you that Isaiah Webb was a victim long before he was a defendant. That he endured years of abuse at Ashford Academy, a prestigious institution that failed to protect him because his father was a janitor and his tormentor's family name was on the buildings. We will show you that the school administration ignored complaints, minimized abuse, and essentially gave Trenton Whitmore permission to destroy Isaiah's mental health and self-worth." She paused, letting that sink in. "And on the night of October 15th, when Isaiah encountered Trenton after 5 years of trying to heal and move on, Trenton couldn't resist one more opportunity to mock him, to belittle him, to remind him that in Trenton's eyes, Isaiah would never be good enough. And Isaiah, after years of abuse, after years of being told to just take it, to be the bigger person, to ignore the cruelty, Isaiah finally pushed back. Literally. One push. Not a punch. Not a weapon. A push. Did he intend to kill Trenton Whitmore? Absolutely not. Did he intend to seriously injure him? No. He intended to make him stop. To create distance. To finally, after all those years, defend himself. The jury was listening now, at least some of them. Jennifer could see it in their faces. The beginning of doubt, the recognition that maybe this wasn't as simple as the prosecution claimed. "The law recognizes that human beings have limits," Jennifer continued. "That there's only so much abuse a person can take before they break. The prosecution wants you to believe Isaiah should have just walked away that night. But I ask you this, at what point does walking away become impossible? At what point does years of trauma make it impossible to respond rationally when faced with your abuser? At what point do we acknowledge that victims of prolonged abuse reach a breaking point?" Chin was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is essentially arguing that the defendant is not responsible for his actions because of things that happened years ago in high school. That's not a legal defense to manslaughter." Judge Blackstone looked at Jennifer. "Counselor, I hope you're not suggesting that past bullying justifies homicide." "No, Your Honor," Jennifer said carefully. "I'm suggesting that it provides essential context for understanding Isaiah Webb's state of mind that night. It speaks to intent, to whether this was a premeditated act of revenge or a spontaneous reaction born of trauma." "Tread carefully," the judge warned. "I'll allow some testimony about the defendant's high school experience, but only as it relates to his mental state at the time of the incident. I will not let this trial become a referendum on Ashford Academy or adolescent social dynamics. Clear?" "Yes, Your Honor." The defense's first witness was Marcus Webb. He took the stand looking older than his 54 years, the weight of the past 17 months evident in every line of his face. Jennifer asked him to describe Isaiah's childhood, his decision to enroll Isaiah at Ashford, what he'd observed about his son's experience there. Marcus spoke quietly but clearly, his love for his son evident in every word. He described finding Isaiah crying in the bathroom, the panic attacks, the nightmares. He described going to the school administration, being dismissed, being told essentially that his son needed to toughen up. "I worked at that school for 22 years, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cleaned their floors, their bathrooms, their classrooms. I was invisible to most of them, but I was proud of my work. And I thought, naively, that if I could just get my son through those doors, he'd have opportunities one never had. I thought education would be his way up. Instead, it broke him." "Objection," Chin said. The witness is speculating about his son's emotional state and making inflammatory characterizations of the school. Sustained. Mr. Webb, please stick to what you directly observed. Marcus nodded. I observed my son withdrawing, getting quieter, losing weight, having anxiety attacks, taking medication for depression. I observed him going from a happy, curious child to someone who barely spoke, who had no friends, who dreaded waking up each morning. And did you ever observe interactions between Isaiah and Trenton Whitmore? A few times. I'd see Trenton and his friends surrounding Isaiah in the hallway, laughing at him. Once I saw Trenton deliberately knock Isaiah's books out of his hands, then walk away laughing. When I tried to say something, Trenton looked right through me like I didn't exist. What did you do? I went to the administration. Multiple times. I begged them to intervene. They'd say they'd look into it, but nothing ever changed. The Whitmore family was too important. Their name was everywhere at that school. My son didn't matter. Chen's cross-examination was brief but pointed. Mr. Webb, isn't it true that your son never reported being physically assaulted by Trenton Whitmore? The bullying was mostly psychological. Please answer the question. Physical assault, yes or no? There were incidents. But your son never filed a formal complaint about physical assault, correct? Marcus hesitated. No. He didn't want to make things worse. And isn't it true that despite these alleged difficulties, Isaiah graduated from Ashford Academy? Yes. So the school provided him with an education, gave him opportunities through their reduced tuition program, and he completed his studies there. That doesn't sound like an institution that broke him, does it? Marcus's hands clenched. A diploma doesn't mean. Thank you, Mr. Webb. No further questions. The defense called several of Isaiah's former classmates, students who'd witnessed the bullying. This was the most difficult part of Jennifer's case, because most of Ashford's alumni didn't want to testify against Trenton or the school. Their loyalty was to the institution, to their shared privilege, to the unspoken code that you don't air the community's dirty laundry. But Jennifer found 3 who were willing to tell the truth. The first was a young woman named Sarah Nguyen who'd been in Isaiah's class since 3rd grade. She testified about the social media attacks, the fake Instagram account, the way Trenton had organized systematic exclusion and mockery. Everyone knew Isaiah was being bullied, Sarah said. It was constant. And everyone knew Trenton was leading it. But nobody said anything because Trenton was popular, and going against him meant social suicide. Did you ever see teachers or administrators intervene? No. They either didn't notice or didn't care. I think they didn't want to deal with it because of who Trenton's family was. The second witness was a young man named James Patel who'd been on the periphery of Trenton's social circle. He testified about the locker room incident, about Trenton bragging about getting away with things because of his family's donations. Trenton used to joke that his dad could buy his way out of anything, James said. He knew he was untouchable at Ashford. And he used that power to make Isaiah's life miserable. Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you tell anyone? James looked ashamed. Because I was scared. Scared of becoming a target myself. It's cowardly, I know. But that's the truth. The third witness was Trenton's own roommate from Yale, a student named Daniel Richardson. Daniel was taking a huge risk testifying, potentially alienating himself from his entire social circle, but his conscience had apparently won out. Daniel testified that Trenton had bragged about the bullying, had laughed about Isaiah, had called him pathetic and said he'd put that scholarship kid in his place throughout high school. Did Trenton ever express remorse for his treatment of Isaiah Webb? Jennifer asked. No, Daniel said quietly. He thought it was funny. He'd tell stories at parties about messing with the janitor's kid. People would laugh. I laughed too at first before I understood what he was really describing. And based on your time living with Trenton, what would you say his attitude was toward people he considered beneath him socially? Chin objected, but the judge allowed Daniel to answer. Trenton believed in a hierarchy, Daniel said carefully. He believed some people were meant to lead and others were meant to serve. He said it explicitly multiple times. He'd talk about how society needed workers and how people should accept their place. He had complete contempt for anyone he saw as lower class. This testimony was damaging, but Chen's cross-examination undermined it. Mr. Richardson, isn't it true that you and Trenton had a falling out before his death? We had disagreements, yes. In fact, didn't Trenton report you to the dean for academic dishonesty? Daniel flushed. That was a misunderstanding that was resolved. But you had a motive to paint Trenton in a negative light, didn't you? A grudge, perhaps. No, I'm just telling the truth about what I witnessed. or you're settling a score with someone who's not here to defend himself. No further questions. The defense's most important witness was Isaiah himself. Jennifer had debated whether to put him on the stand. Defendants testifying always carried risks, but she decided the jury needed to hear directly from him, to see him as a human being rather than the monster the prosecution had portrayed. Isaiah took the stand wearing the same borrowed suit, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. He looked young and scared and completely out of place in that formal setting. Jennifer approached him gently. "Isaiah, tell the jury about your first day at Ashford Academy." Isaiah's voice was soft, and the judge had to ask him to speak up. "I was excited," Isaiah said louder now. "My dad had worked so hard to get me there. I thought it was going to be amazing, like this incredible opportunity." "And what was it actually like?" "At first, I didn't understand why the other kids were treating me differently. I was 8. I didn't get class dynamics or social hierarchies. I just knew that nobody wanted to be my friend, that people whispered about me, that I was always alone." "When did you first encounter Trenton Whitmore?" "He was in my class from the beginning. He was the one who started calling me Janitor's kid. Everyone else picked it up from him. That became my name to most people. Not Isaiah. Janitor's kid." Jennifer walked him through the years of bullying, letting him describe incident after incident. The courtroom was silent as Isaiah recounted the locker room humiliation, the fake sexual assault accusation, the daily microaggressions that had accumulated into a crushing weight. "Did you ever think about hurting Trenton?" Jennifer asked, knowing the prosecution would bring it up if she didn't. Isaiah hesitated. "I thought about what I'd say to him if I ever got the chance. How I'd tell him what he did to me, how much damage he caused. But I never thought about physically hurting him. I just wanted him to leave me alone." "Let's talk about October 15th. Tell the jury what happened that night." Isaiah took a deep breath. "I was leaving work. I was exhausted. And then I saw him. Trenton. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. I'd been trying to move on, trying to build a life. And seeing him brought everything back. All of it. Like the 5 years disappeared and I was right back at Ashford, being humiliated." "What did he say to you?" "He called me Janitor's kid again. Asked what I was doing in this neighborhood, like I didn't belong there either. He was with his friends and they were laughing and it was like high school all over again. Like nothing had changed. Like I'd never escape him." Isaiah's voice cracked. "And I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't walk away and let him win again. I couldn't be the victim one more time. So I pushed him. I just wanted him to stop talking, to stop laughing at me. I didn't mean for him to fall. Didn't mean for him to hit his head. I just wanted him to stop." "Do you regret what happened?" "Every second of every day," Isaiah said, tears now flowing freely. "I think about Trenton's family, about his girlfriend, about everything he could have done with his life. And I think about my dad, about how I destroyed everything he worked for. I wish I'd just walked away. I wish I'd been stronger. But I wasn't. And now Trenton's dead and I have to live with that forever." It was powerful testimony, genuine and heartbreaking. Several jurors were clearly moved. But Chen's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Webb, you said you just wanted him to stop talking. Is violence your typical response when someone says something you don't like?" "No, that's not." "Have you pushed other people who've said things that upset you?" "No." "So why Trenton Whitmore? Why did he deserve violence when others don't?" "He didn't deserve, I didn't mean." "You testified that seeing Trenton brought back all your feelings from high school. All your anger, all your resentment. That's premeditated violence, isn't it? You had years to think about what you'd like to do to Trenton Whitmore, and when you finally saw him, you acted on those thoughts. That's not what happened. You pushed him with enough force to cause a fatal fall. That's not a light push, is it? That's not creating a little distance. That's attacking someone with enough violence to kill them. I didn't know he'd fall like that. He was drunk, off balance." "Oh, so now it's Trenton's fault that your violent act killed him? Because he'd been drinking?" Jennifer objected, and the judge sustained it, but the damage was done. Chen had planted the seed that Isaiah was blaming the victim, refusing to take responsibility. "Mr. Webb, did you ever seek professional help for your alleged trauma from high school?" "I saw a therapist for a while, yes." "Did that therapist ever diagnose you with a condition that would explain your violent outburst?" "I had anxiety and depression." "Did your therapist ever say you were dangerous? That you had violent tendencies?" "No." "So even a mental health professional who treated you never thought you posed a threat to others. Yet you want this jury to believe that years of high school bullying gave you no choice but to violently attack Trenton Whitmore when you encountered him as an adult. I didn't attack him. I pushed him once. A push that killed him. No further questions. Isaiah left the stand looking defeated, and Jennifer knew they'd lost ground. The prosecution's narrative was too strong, too simple. Isaiah had killed someone because he couldn't control his temper, and nothing from his past justified that. The defense called a psychologist, Dr. Ramona Foster, to testify about the long-term effects of bullying, about trauma responses, about how victims of sustained abuse can reach breaking points. She was articulate and credible, explaining in clinical terms what Isaiah had experienced. Prolonged bullying, especially during crucial developmental years, can cause lasting psychological damage, Dr. Foster testified. We're talking about complex PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression, and in severe cases, a complete erosion of self-worth. Victims often experience hypervigilance, meaning they're constantly on alert for threats. When they encounter their abuser later in life, even years later, their body can respond as if the original trauma is happening again. It's called triggering. In your professional opinion, Jennifer asked, could Isaiah Webb's actions on October 15th be understood as a trauma response? Absolutely. Based on the history described, encountering Trenton Whitmore and being subjected to the same type of mockery that had traumatized him for years could have triggered a fight-or-flight response. Isaiah's push could be understood as his brain finally choosing fight after years of choosing flight. But Chen's cross-examination was effective. Dr. Foster, are you suggesting that anyone who was bullied in high school has a right to violently attack their bullies as adults? No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm explaining the psychological mechanisms. Yes or no, doctor? Do past experiences of bullying legally excuse violence? No, but... Thank you. And isn't it true that millions of people experience bullying and manage not to kill anyone? Yes, but each person's experience and response is different. So most people who were bullied don't become violent. Which suggests that Isaiah Webb's response was not normal or inevitable, correct? Dr. Foster looked frustrated. Context matters. The severity and duration of the bullying, the individual's support systems, their coping mechanisms. But ultimately, Isaiah Webb made a choice to use violence, didn't he? He wasn't possessed or controlled by his trauma. He chose to push Trenton Whitmore. In that moment, his capacity for rational choice was likely compromised. Likely compromised. Not eliminated. So he still had agency, he still made a decision, and that decision killed someone. No further questions. The defense rested after 5 days. They presented a compelling picture of Isaiah as a victim who'd been pushed to his breaking point, but they hadn't overcome the fundamental problem. Trenton had been drunk and unarmed, and Isaiah had been the physical aggressor. In the eyes of the law, that made Isaiah responsible for Trenton's death. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following week. The weekend between the end of testimony and closing arguments was torture for Isaiah. He lay in his cell at Rikers, replaying everything in his mind, knowing his fate would soon be in the hands of 12 strangers who'd probably already made up their minds. Marcus visited on Sunday. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, hands pressed against opposite sides of the plexiglass divider, connected only by that touch and their shared despair. Whatever happens, Marcus said, his voice breaking, I want you to know I love you. I'm proud of you. None of this is your fault. It is my fault, Isaiah said. I killed him, Dad. I let my anger control me and now someone's dead. He tormented you for years. The system failed you. That school failed you. I failed you. You didn't fail me. You gave me everything. You sacrificed everything. I'm the one who failed. I should have been stronger. They cried together, separated by plexiglass and the unbridgeable distance between where they were and where they'd hoped to be. Monday morning, February 27th, the courtroom was even more packed than before. This was it. The final arguments, then deliberation, then a verdict that would determine whether Isaiah Webb spent the next 15 years in prison or walked free. Marcus Chin delivered the prosecution's closing argument with the confidence of someone who knew he'd already won. He stood before the jury, his expression grave, his voice filled with controlled emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have spent 2 weeks examining the events of October 15th. 2 weeks of testimony, evidence, and arguments. But ultimately, this case comes down to a very simple question. Is violence an acceptable response to words? Does being upset about something that happened years ago give you the right to physically attack someone? He paused, looking at each juror. The defense wants you to believe that Isaiah Webb had no choice. That years of being bullied in high school meant he couldn't help but violently shove Trenton Whitmore when they encountered each other as adults. They want you to excuse his actions because of his past. Chin walked over to the defense table, stood behind Isaiah. But think about what that means. If we accept that logic, then anyone who had a difficult adolescence, anyone who was teased or excluded or treated badly in school, would have license to attack their former classmates. Millions of people experience bullying. It's wrong, it's harmful, and schools should do more to prevent it. But it does not justify murder. He moved to stand in front of the jury box. Because that's what this is, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a tragic accident. It's not a momentary lapse in judgment. It's murder. The defendant saw someone from his past, someone he resented, and he made a conscious decision to use physical force against that person. He chose violence. And that choice killed Trenton Whitmore. Chin's voice rose with passion. Trenton Whitmore was 23 years old. He'd graduated from Yale. He was planning to go to law school. He wanted to work in public service to make a difference in the world. He had a girlfriend who loved him, parents who adored him, a whole life ahead of him. And all of that was taken away in one moment of rage by someone who couldn't let go of the past. He picked up an enlarged photo of Trenton, smiling in his Yale graduation gown, and held it up for the jury to see. This is who the defendant killed. Not a bully. Not a monster. A young man trying to live his life. Yes, maybe he said something insensitive that night. Maybe his joke was in poor taste. But those words didn't threaten the defendant's safety. They didn't justify violence. Chin set the photo down. The defense has tried to make this case about class warfare, about institutional inequality, about the failures of our education system. But this case is not about any of those things. This case is about personal responsibility. About the fact that we all face difficult situations, we all encounter people who upset us, and we all have to make choices about how to respond. Most of us choose to walk away. Isaiah Webb chose violence. He returned to stand directly in front of the jury. When you go into that deliberation room, you're going to have to answer one question. Does Isaiah Webb's past excuse his decision to kill Trenton Whitmore? And if you have any respect for the rule of law, if you believe that people must be held accountable for their actions, if you believe that violence cannot be excused by grievance, then there is only one verdict you can return. Guilty of manslaughter. Thank you. It was a powerful closing, and Jennifer knew she had to counter it with everything she had. She stood, took a deep breath, and approached the jury with a different kind of energy, not the righteous certainty of the prosecution, but the desperate passion of someone fighting against an unjust system. Members of the jury, she began, Mr. Chin is right about one thing. This case is about personal responsibility. But whose responsibility are we really talking about? Isaiah Webb's responsibility for one push that resulted in an unintended death? Or the responsibility of an institution that allowed systematic abuse to continue for years? Or the responsibility of Trenton Whitmore himself for the cruelty he inflicted? Jennifer walked toward the jury box, her voice growing stronger. The prosecution wants you to see this case in a vacuum. They want you to forget everything that came before October 15th and focus only on that single moment. But justice doesn't work that way. Context matters. History matters. The law recognizes this. That's why we consider provocation, why we distinguish between premeditated murder and manslaughter, why we acknowledge that human beings are not robots programmed to respond perfectly to every situation. She picked up a folder from the defense table, thick with documents. For 10 years, let me repeat that, 10 years, Isaiah Webb endured systematic psychological torture. Not typical adolescent teasing. Not schoolyard roughhousing. Systematic, deliberate, organized cruelty designed to destroy his sense of self-worth. Trenton Whitmore led that campaign of abuse, and he did it with impunity because his family's wealth and influence made him untouchable. Jennifer opened the folder, pulled out photographs. These are screenshots from the Instagram account Trenton and his friends created to mock Isaiah. Look at these captions. Look at the comments. This went on for years, and when Isaiah's father complained to the school, he was essentially told that his son needed to toughen up. The institution that was supposed to protect him instead protected his abuser. She set the photos down, her voice softening. The prosecution showed you a picture of Trenton in his Yale graduation gown and asked you to mourn the future he lost. And you should mourn it. His death was tragic. But I want you to also see another picture. Jennifer held up a school photo of Isaiah from 8th grade. A thin boy with haunted eyes, trying to smile for the camera but the smile not quite reaching his eyes. This is Isaiah Webb at 13. Look at his face. Really look at it. This is a child who's been broken by constant abuse. A child who went to school every day knowing he'd be mocked, excluded, humiliated. A child whose father was working himself to death to give him opportunities, while Trenton Whitmore worked just as hard to destroy him. She set the photo down carefully. The prosecution wants you to believe that Isaiah should have gotten over it by the time he was 23. That 5 years away from Ashford should have erased the trauma of a decade of abuse. But trauma doesn't work that way. The psychological scars from prolonged bullying don't disappear just because you graduate. They follow you. They shape how you see yourself, how you interact with the world, how you respond to threats. Jennifer moved closer to the jury. And on October 15th, Isaiah Webb encountered his abuser. Not in a neutral setting. Not in a safe environment. But on a dark street at 11 p.m., when Isaiah was exhausted and vulnerable. And what did Trenton do? Did he apologize for the years of cruelty? Did he acknowledge the harm he'd caused? No. He mocked Isaiah one more time. Called him janitor's kid, again. Laughed at him with his friends. Treated him exactly the way he'd treated him for years. She paused, letting that sink in. The prosecution says Isaiah should have walked away. And in an ideal world, maybe he should have. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where victims of abuse carry that trauma with them. Where encountering your abuser can trigger a response that's not rational, not measured, not what a courtroom full of people evaluating your actions 2 years later might consider appropriate. Jennifer's voice grew passionate. Isaiah Webb pushed Trenton Whitmore once. One push. He didn't punch him. Didn't kick him. Didn't pull out a weapon. He pushed him, trying to create space, trying to make the mockery stop. And tragically, Trenton fell in a way that caused a fatal injury. But that tragic outcome doesn't change Isaiah's intent. He didn't intend to kill Trenton. He didn't even intend to seriously hurt him. He intended to make him back off. She walked back to the defense table, stood beside Isaiah. The law recognizes that intent matters. That's why we have different degrees of homicide. That's why manslaughter is different from murder. The prosecution has charged Isaiah with manslaughter, which requires recklessness, acting in a way that creates a substantial risk of serious injury or death. But Isaiah's single push in response to provocation from someone who'd tormented him for years was not reckless. It was a defensive reaction from someone who'd been pushed to his psychological limit. Jennifer looked at each juror. I'm not asking you to excuse what happened. Trenton Whitmore's death is a tragedy that will haunt Isaiah Webb for the rest of his life. But I am asking you to understand it. To see it in the full context of these two young men's history. To recognize that there are no winners here, only victims. Trenton, who died, and Isaiah, who has to live with having caused that death. She returned to stand before them. When you deliberate, I want you to ask yourselves, could I have walked away? If I'd endured 10 years of systematic abuse, if I'd finally escaped it and tried to build a life, and then my abuser appeared and mocked me one more time, could I have been strong enough to just walk away? If you can honestly say yes, that you would have had perfect self-control in that moment, then maybe you can convict Isaiah Webb. Jennifer's voice grew quiet but intense. But if you have even a shred of doubt, if you can imagine how trauma might affect someone's ability to respond rationally, if you can see that Isaiah Webb was not a cold-blooded killer but a damaged young man who finally broke after years of abuse, then you must find him not guilty. Because that's what the law requires. Not certainty of innocence, but reasonable doubt about guilt. Thank you. The courtroom was silent as Jennifer sat down. Isaiah was crying quietly, his shoulders shaking. Marcus, in the gallery, had his head in his hands. The Whitmore family looked furious, as if Jennifer's defense of Isaiah was itself an attack on their son's memory. Judge Blackstone addressed the jury, his voice formal and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard all the evidence and arguments in this case. It's now your responsibility to determine the facts and apply the law as I instruct you. He spent the next hour giving jury instructions, explaining the elements of manslaughter, the burden of proof, the meaning of reasonable doubt. The jurors listened intently, some taking notes, others just staring at the judge with the weight of their impending decision evident on their faces. You must determine, Judge Blackstone said, whether the defendant recklessly caused the death of Trenton Whitmore. Recklessly means consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk. The risk must be of such nature and degree that disregarding it constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of conduct that a reasonable person would observe in the situation. He looked at the jury over his reading glasses. The defendant's emotional state may be considered, but only as it relates to whether he acted recklessly. Past experiences do not excuse criminal conduct, but they may provide context for evaluating the defendant's actions. Your verdict must be based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, not on sympathy or prejudice. At 3:15 p.m., the jury retired to deliberate. Isaiah was taken back to the holding cell. Marcus waited in the courthouse, unable to leave, unable to eat, just pacing the hallways and praying. The Whitmore family held court in a private room the courthouse had provided, surrounded by supporters and counsel. The waiting was excruciating. Hours passed with no word. The legal experts on the news channels debated what the delay might mean. Some said a quick verdict would favor the prosecution, that the case was open and shut. Others argued that a lengthy deliberation suggested the jury was taking the defense argument seriously, that they were struggling with the moral complexities. Day 1 of deliberations ended at 9 p.m. with no verdict. The jury was sent home with stern instructions not to discuss the case with anyone or consume any media coverage. Everyone returned Tuesday morning and the waiting continued. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 jurors were indeed struggling. They'd taken an initial vote. 7 for guilty, 4 for not guilty, 1 undecided. The divide largely fell along predictable lines. Older, more conservative jurors leaning toward conviction, younger, more liberal jurors leaning toward acquittal. The foreman was a 54-year-old accountant named Robert Chin who believed strongly in law and order. He'd been pushing for conviction from the start. The law is clear, he kept saying. The defendant used physical force that resulted in death. His reasons for being upset don't change that fact. But one of the younger jurors, a 29-year-old teacher named Maya Johnson, pushed back. Did you hear the testimony about what that boy went through? 10 years of abuse. The school did nothing. And then his abuser shows up and mocks him again. How is he supposed to react? Like an adult, Robert responded. By walking away. By not using violence. Easy to say when you've never been in that situation, Maya countered. When you've never been systematically dehumanized for years. Another juror, a 42-year-old nurse named Patricia Walsh, spoke up. I was bullied in school. It was horrible. But I never pushed anyone, much less killed them. We can't just excuse violence because someone had a hard time growing up. But this wasn't just a hard time, said Marcus Liu, a 36-year-old engineer. This was sustained, deliberate psychological torture by someone who used their privilege to avoid consequences. There has to be some recognition of that. They went around and around, dissecting every piece of evidence, every moment of testimony. Some focused on the legal elements. Had Isaiah acted recklessly? Others focused on the moral dimensions. Did Trenton bear some responsibility for creating the situation that led to his death? By Wednesday afternoon, they'd taken 4 more votes. The count shifted, 8 for guilty, 4 for not guilty. The not guilty jurors were holding firm, but they were in the minority. The question was whether they could convince enough others to create reasonable doubt. Thursday morning, Judge Blackstone called the jury back into court. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been deliberating for over 30 hours across 3 days. I want to know if you believe you can reach a unanimous verdict. The foreman stood. Your Honor, we're deadlocked. I don't believe further deliberation will change anyone's position. Judge Blackstone frowned. I'm going to ask you to continue deliberating. This is an important case, and the parties deserve a verdict if one can be reached. I'll give you until end of day Friday. If you remain deadlocked at that point, I'll declare a mistrial. A mistrial would mean starting over. New jury, new trial, months more of Isaiah's life in limbo. The prosecution could try again, and given the resources the Whitmore family had poured into this case, they certainly would. The jury continued deliberating Thursday afternoon and all day Friday. The tension in that room was palpable. People who'd been polite strangers 2 weeks ago were now snapping at each other, exhausted by the weight of the decision before them. One of the guilty voters, a 68-year-old retired teacher named Dorothy Hanson, began to waver. She'd been listening to Maya's arguments about trauma, about context, about how the system had failed Isaiah. What if we're punishing him for breaking when maybe anyone would have broken? She asked the room. Not anyone, Robert countered. Plenty of people endure bullying and don't become violent. But should we judge him by what other people might do, or by what he could reasonably do given what he'd experienced? Dorothy asked. I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure we can say beyond reasonable doubt that he acted with the kind of recklessness the law requires. Her uncertainty rippled through the room. Another juror admitted he'd been having similar doubts. By Friday afternoon, the count had shifted again. 6 for guilty, 6 for not guilty. They were exactly split. And as the clock ticked toward 5 p.m., when Judge Blackstone would be expecting their final answer, the pressure mounted. Robert made one last impassioned argument for conviction, citing the rule of law, the need for consequences, the impossibility of functioning as a society if people could use violence whenever they felt provoked. Maya countered with an equally passionate argument about justice versus vengeance, about how sending Isaiah to prison for 15 years wouldn't bring Trenton back and would only destroy another life. At 4:45 p.m., they took a final vote. The result? Still 6-6. They were hopelessly deadlocked. When they returned to the courtroom at 5 p.m., the tension was suffocating. Isaiah sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Marcus was in the front row of the gallery, barely breathing. The Whitmore family looked angry and impatient, as if the jury's inability to convict immediately was itself an injustice. Judge Blackstone addressed the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "No, Your Honor. We remain deadlocked at 6-6. We've deliberated extensively and taken multiple votes. I don't believe we can reach unanimity." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blackstone looked displeased but unsurprised. "Very well. I'm declaring a mistrial. The jury is dismissed with the court's thanks for your service. The defendant will remain in custody pending a decision by the prosecution on whether to retry this case." And just like that, 17 months of waiting, 2 weeks of trial, and 4 days of deliberation ended in nothing. No closure. No resolution. Just more uncertainty. The Whitmore family was furious. Diane Whitmore stood up, shouting toward Isaiah. "Murderer! You murdered my son. This isn't over." Bailiffs moved to escort her out as she continued screaming. Trenton's father, Bradford Whitmore, stood with his arm around his wife, his face a mask of cold fury. "We will retry this case," he said to the assembled media as he left the courtroom. "We will get justice for our son. That man will pay for what he did." Isaiah was taken back to Rikers, and Marcus stood in the courtroom long after everyone else had left, trying to process what had just happened. They were back where they'd started, except now Isaiah had endured a full trial, had been forced to relive his trauma in front of the world, and still had no resolution. The prosecution announced within a week that they would retry the case. The Whitmore family issued a statement saying they wouldn't rest until Isaiah was convicted. The retrial was scheduled for 6 months later, August 2023. But something happened in those intervening months that changed everything. Public opinion began to shift. The case had generated massive media attention, and journalists started digging deeper into the story. They found more Ashford students willing to talk about the culture of bullying at the school, about the institutional protection of wealthy students, about the systematic way certain kids were marked as acceptable targets. A former Ashford teacher wrote an op-ed in the New York Times describing the school's two-tiered system. Elite students who could do no wrong and everyone else. A prestigious investigative journalism outlet did a deep dive into the Whitmore family's donations to Ashford and how those donations coincided with Trenton avoiding consequences for documented incidents of bullying. Social media erupted with people sharing their own stories of being bullied, of institutions failing to protect them, of carrying trauma that shaped their adult lives. #JusticeForIsaiah started trending. Protesters began showing up at Ashford Academy, demanding accountability. The school, faced with a PR nightmare and potential lawsuits from other families whose children had been bullied, commissioned an independent investigation into their handling of bullying complaints. The results were damning. Over 100 families came forward with complaints that had been ignored or minimized. The report concluded that Ashford had systematically prioritized donor relationships over student welfare, and had created an environment where bullying thrived unchecked. Dr. Pemberton resigned in disgrace. Several board members stepped down. The school issued a formal apology and announced sweeping reforms, though many questioned whether it was genuine change or just damage control. The shifting public sentiment put pressure on the prosecution. The Manhattan DA's office was facing criticism for pursuing a retrial so aggressively when the first jury had been evenly split. Op-eds questioned whether this was really about justice or about wealthy families using the legal system to punish someone who dared to push back against their son. In June 2023, the prosecution made an offer. Isaiah could plead guilty to a reduced charge of criminally negligent homicide and serve 3 years in prison, with credit for time served. He'd be out in less than 2 years. Jennifer brought the offer to Isaiah in Rikers. She explained that if they went to trial again, the outcome was uncertain. Another hung jury was possible. But so was conviction, which would mean 15 years. The plea deal was a compromise, a way to avoid that risk. Isaiah sat across from her in the visitation room, looking older than his 23 years, prison having aged him in ways that showed in his eyes more than his face. "Will they leave my dad alone if I take it?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "The Whitmores. If I plead guilty, admit I killed their son, will they stop going after my dad? Because I heard they've been trying to get him fired, to destroy him because of what I did. Jennifer's heart broke. Even now, after everything, Isaiah was trying to protect his father. I can negotiate that as part of the plea. That they agree to no civil suit against you or your father, no further harassment. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll take it. Tell them I'll plead guilty. Just make them leave my dad alone. Isaiah, are you sure? We have a real chance at the retrial. Public opinion has shifted. We might get a jury that... I'm sure. I'm tired, Ms. Valdez. I just want this to be over. I want my dad to be able to live his life without being punished for what I did. The plea hearing was scheduled for July 14, 2023. Isaiah appeared before Judge Blackstone, standing in his prison jumpsuit, and formally pleaded guilty to criminally negligent homicide. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced him to 3 years, with credit for the 19 months he'd already served. Isaiah would be eligible for parole in less than a year. The Whitmore family issued a statement saying they were satisfied that Isaiah had finally admitted his guilt and that justice had been served. But their satisfaction felt hollow, performative. Trenton was still dead. Isaiah was still going to prison. 2 families were destroyed. And the systemic issues that had created this tragedy remained largely unaddressed. Isaiah served the remainder of his sentence at Otisville Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He worked in the prison library, earned his GED, took college courses through a prison education program. He was a model inmate, quiet and respectful, just trying to get through each day. Marcus visited him every other week, making the long journey upstate, sitting across from his son in the visitation room, both of them trying to stay hopeful that someday this nightmare would end. In March 2024, Isaiah appeared before the parole board. He'd served 2 years and 2 months of his 3-year sentence. The board reviewed his case, his clean disciplinary record, his educational achievements in prison, the letters of support from his father and others. The board chair, a stern woman in her 60s, looked at Isaiah across the table. Mr. Webb, do you understand the gravity of what you did? Yes, ma'am, Isaiah said quietly. Every day. I took someone's life. Someone who had family, who loved him, a future ahead of him. Nothing I say or do can change that. I have to live with that forever. If you're released, what's your plan? I want to finish my education. I've been taking college courses here and I'd like to continue. I want to work, support my father who's supported me my whole life. And I want to find some way to do something meaningful with my life, to maybe help other kids who are going through what I went through so they don't end up where I am. The parole board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the chair delivered their decision. Mr. Webb, this board has decided to grant your application for parole, effective immediately. You'll be released under supervision, required to check in with your parole officer weekly, maintain employment or full-time enrollment in education, and complete 200 hours of community service. Do you understand these conditions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Isaiah walked out of Otisville on March 22, 2024, 2 years and 5 months after that October night that changed everything. Marcus was there to pick him up, and father and son embraced in the parking lot, both crying, both overwhelmed by the simple fact that this chapter was finally over. But the story doesn't end there. Because the question this case raised, the question that divided that jury and divided the nation, remains unresolved. What do we owe victims of systematic abuse? What responsibility do institutions have to protect vulnerable people in their care? And what happens when someone who's been victimized for years finally breaks? Isaiah Webb is now 24 years old. He's enrolled at community college studying social work. He lives with his father in a small apartment, works part-time at a youth center, and is trying to build a life after prison. He doesn't give interviews, doesn't seek attention, just tries to do his time on parole quietly and move forward. Marcus Webb retired from Ashford Academy shortly after Isaiah's conviction. The school offered him a small severance package, which he used to pay off some of the legal debts from Isaiah's case. He works now as a building superintendent, still doing the same kind of work but in a place that doesn't carry the weight of so many bad memories. The Whitmore family has channeled their grief into advocacy, starting a foundation in Trenton's name that funds anti-violence programs. They've never publicly acknowledged the role their son's actions played in creating the circumstances that led to his death. In their narrative, Trenton remains the perfect victim, and Isaiah remains simply a murderer. Ashford Academy implemented new anti-bullying policies, hired counselors, created anonymous reporting systems. Whether these changes represent genuine institutional transformation or just performative reform remains to be seen. Time will tell if the culture truly shifts or if the fundamental hierarchy, where some students matter more than others, persists beneath a veneer of progressive language. The case itself has become a touchstone in debates about class, privilege, justice, and the long-term effects of bullying. Law schools use it as a teaching tool about provocation and self-defense. Psychology courses examine it as an example of trauma responses. Sociologists analyze it as a window into institutional inequality. But at its core, this case is about two boys. Two boys who went to the same school but lived in completely different worlds. One boy whose family name was literally carved into the buildings, who walked through life knowing he was protected, important, entitled to take up space and demand respect. Another boy whose father cleaned those buildings, who walked through life knowing he was disposable, invisible, expected to accept whatever treatment came his way. Those two boys collided on October night, and one of them died and one of them went to prison, and everyone involved lost something they'll never get back. The courtroom is empty now. The protesters have gone home. The media has moved on to new tragedies, new outrages, new stories to tell. But the questions remain. About justice and vengeance. About victim and perpetrator. About when someone who's been hurt gets to hurt back, and what we as a society do when they cross that line. There are no easy answers. No simple resolutions. Just the messy, complicated reality of human beings failing each other in ways large and small, and a legal system trying to sort through the wreckage and decide who pays the price. Isaiah Webb pushed Trenton Whitmore one time. One push, 10 years of rage behind it, a lifetime of consequences flowing from it. Was it justified? Was it murder? Was it the inevitable result of systematic abuse? Or was it a choice, a moment where Isaiah could have walked away but didn't? The jury couldn't decide. The nation couldn't decide. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some questions don't have clear answers. Maybe we have to sit with the discomfort of acknowledging that Isaiah was both victim and perpetrator, that Trenton was both abuser and victim, that the truth is more complicated than any verdict could capture. What we can say with certainty is this: the system failed both boys. Ashford Academy failed to protect Isaiah from years of abuse. The Whitmore family failed to teach Trenton that cruelty has consequences. The justice system failed to account for the full context of what happened that October night. Everyone failed and everyone paid a price. Isaiah Webb served his time. He's out now, trying to rebuild a life from the rubble of what might have been. Trenton Whitmore is dead, buried in a cemetery where his family visits every week, his potential forever unrealized. Two families are broken. A school had to reckon with its complicity. And the rest of us are left to wonder what we would have done, how we would have judged, whether we could have been more compassionate or more just. The marble floors of Courtroom 6B still gleam under fluorescent lights, waiting for the next case, the next tragedy, the next impossible question about right and wrong. The law will continue trying to fit human complexity into neat categories. Prosecutors will continue seeking convictions. Defense attorneys will continue fighting for their clients. Juries will continue struggling with impossible decisions. And somewhere out there, in classrooms and cafeterias and hallways, other children are being bullied. Other Isaiahs are enduring daily humiliation while institutions look the other way. Other Trentons are learning that cruelty without consequence is simply power. The cycle continues, and we collectively decide whether to interrupt it or let it play out until the next tragedy forces us to pay attention. This is the story of Isaiah Webb and Trenton Whitmore. But it's also the story of every person who's been systematically dehumanized and told to just take it. Every person who's wielded privilege like a weapon. Every institution that's protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Every moment where we as individuals and as a society have to decide whether to intervene or look away. The verdict in the court of public opinion remains split, just like that jury. Some people see Isaiah as a murderer who let his anger override his judgment. Others see him as a victim who finally broke after years of abuse. Most people, if they're honest, see elements of both: the complicated truth that he was pushed beyond what any person should have to endure, and that his response, while understandable, cost someone their life. What's your verdict? Do you believe Isaiah Webb is a murderer who deserves to be in prison? Or do you believe he's a victim who was pushed to his breaking point by years of systematic abuse? Do you think the justice system got it right with the plea deal? Or should Isaiah have been acquitted entirely, or convicted of a more serious charge? And here's the harder question. What responsibility do we all bear for creating systems where this kind of tragedy becomes possible? Where some children are protected and others are sacrificed? Where wealth and privilege shield people from consequences while poverty and vulnerability compound trauma? Comment below with your verdict. Tell us how you would have voted if you'd been on that jury. Tell us what you think justice looks like in a case like this. Tell us whether you think Isaiah Webb paid enough for what he did or paid too much, or whether the real criminals were the systems and people who created the circumstances that led to that October night. And if you've experienced bullying, if you've been an Isaiah or known an Isaiah, share your story. Let's talk about the ways institutional indifference allows cruelty to flourish. Let's demand better from schools, from families, from each other. Because the next tragedy is already forming somewhere. Another vulnerable kid is being tormented while adults look away. Another privileged kid is learning that cruelty is consequence-free. And unless we change the systems that create these situations, we'll be back here again, examining another impossible case, asking the same impossible questions, and wondering why we keep failing to protect the people who need protection most. This is Dark Echoes Crime. The echoes of this case will reverberate for years. The questions it raised will outlive all of us. And somewhere tonight, Isaiah Webb is trying to sleep, haunted by the memory of a push that took a life, while Marcus Webb lies awake worrying about his son, and Diane Whitmore clutches a photo of her boy and cries for the future he'll never have. There are no winners in this story. Only survivors, and the question of what we do with the truth once we finally see it clearly. What's your verdict? Comment below. And if this case made you think, made you question, made you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is where change begins. That's where we start demanding better. That's where we acknowledge that justice is more complicated than guilty or not guilty, and that real change requires more than courtroom verdicts. It requires all of us to do better. To protect the vulnerable. To hold the powerful accountable. To recognize that every Isaiah and every Trenton is someone's child, someone's whole world, and that the choices we make about how we structure our institutions and our society determine whether those children get to thrive or whether they become cautionary tales in true crime scripts. The case is closed. But the conversation continues. Join it. Because the next chapter of this story is being written right now, and we all have a role in determining how it ends.